Korean Mafia boss couldn't sleep for 6 years, until his new black maid arrived. 6 years. For 6 long years, the most feared Mafia boss in Seoul had not slept through a single night. Doctors prescribed everything: medication, therapy, experimental treatments from specialists who charged fortunes and delivered nothing. Every night at exactly 1:17 a.m., Jae-hyun would wake from the same waking nightmare. Not a dream, a memory. The night Ji-eun died protecting him. His mansion became a mausoleum. Servants quit within days. Security rotated in silence. Even the air felt wrong, heavy, like the house itself was grieving. Until one night, without warning or permission, his aunt hired someone new. A maid named Chioma, who arrived without fear. And somehow, on the very first night she stepped into that kitchen, the man who had not slept in 6 years finally closed his eyes. But when his doctor rushed into the mansion the next morning expecting the usual devastation, what he found left him completely speechless. If you're new here, welcome back to the shadows. Today we step into the heart of Seoul, where power and grief walk side by side. Imagine carrying the weight of an empire, boardrooms, back alleys, men who vanish at your word, and still being unable to sleep for 6 years. This is the story of Jae-hyun, the man who built an empire from silence, and Chioma, the one woman who dared to walk unafraid into his darkness. Subscribe if you're new, and let's dive into the Mafia boss and the maid. To the outside world, Jae-hyun was untouchable. In the glittering skyline of Seoul, his name moved through boardrooms and back alleys like a whispered warning. He was a man carved from control. No shouting, no chaos, only precise, quiet decisions that erased rivals overnight. Seasoned CEOs struggled to hold his gaze. With a single stillness of expression, he could freeze negotiations cold. His suits were armor. His voice never rose above a lethal calm. Men twice his age walked around the mention of his name. He was, by every visible measure, perfection. But when the city's lights blurred crimson over the Han River and the sun finally sank, the king began to unravel. In the silence of his vast mansion, the transformation was slow and agonizing. He would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching millions of ordinary souls drift toward rest, toward the quiet mercy of sleep, while he remained locked outside it. He wandered halls where expensive art on every wall felt less like wealth and more like evidence. Proof of everything he had traded his humanity to build. The chandeliers dripped cold light. The Persian rugs swallowed his footsteps whole. By 11 p.m., the tremors would begin. First in his hands, the hands that had once held Ji-eun as she slipped away. He would retreat to his master bedroom, a space of white marble and silence that felt less like sanctuary and more like a cell. He would lie flat on his back, staring at the ceiling as if awaiting a sentence. His eyes would find the clock. 1:12. The air thickened. 1:15. His pulse climbed. His jaw tightened. His breathing shortened to shallow, controlled pulls, the discipline of a man who had spent a lifetime refusing to look weak, now reduced to counting seconds. 1:16. He stopped breathing entirely. Not because he had forgotten, because he already knew what was coming. And right on time, as the clock flipped to 1:17 a.m., the world fractured. It was never just a memory. It was a physical assault, a phantom gunshot detonating somewhere behind his eyes, sharp and final. His body would jolt, his muscles locked in a reflex of failed protection. For a split second he felt it all again. The cold fog of that winter parking structure, the warmth of Ji-eun's blood soaking through his shirt, the weight of her body leaning into his arms, her fingers gripping his collar, her eyes not angry, not accusing, just sad. "You promised you'd choose life," she had whispered. Then her hand fell, and the world ended. This is where our story begins. Not with the empire, not with the fear he commanded, or the silence that followed his name through the corridors of Seoul's most dangerous circles. It begins 6 years ago, on a winter night so cold the fog had settled like a burial shroud over the city, swallowing streetlights whole and turning the underground parking structure beneath Han River Plaza into something that felt less like concrete and steel and more like the bottom of the world. Jae-hyun remembered every detail. The way his breath came out in slow white clouds. the distant echo of a car alarm 2 levels above, muffled by the weight of the night. The smell of exhaust and frost and something faintly floral. Her perfume. The one she always wore. The one he had once told her reminded him that gentleness still existed somewhere. Ji-eun stood 10 feet away from him, her coat buttoned to the throat, her hands folded in front of her like someone preparing to say something they had rehearsed 100 times and still weren't ready for. She wasn't part of his world. She had never pretended to be. From the very beginning, Ji-eun had been the single living proof that something in Jae-hyun had not yet turned entirely to stone. She was the woman who argued with him about mercy when everyone else nodded in silence, who left the lights on when he worked through the night because she said darkness was a habit, not a necessity, who once looked at a man who had ordered the ruin of 3 rival organizations and simply said, "You are more than what you do. I need you to believe that." He had almost believed her. Almost. That night in the parking structure, she looked at him the way she always did. Not with fear, not with awe, but with that particular sadness she reserved for conversations she knew he would lose. "Walk away," she said softly. Her voice carried no anger. Just wait. Just the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent years loving something that kept trying to destroy itself. "Walk away from all of it, Jae-hyun, before your world swallows both of us." He didn't answer. The space between them felt enormous, not in distance but in everything that distance represented. The bodies, the debts, the years of choices layered one on top of another like sediment, too deep now to excavate cleanly. "I'm not leaving you," he finally said. "I will never leave you. That's not what I asked." He stepped toward her. 1 step. That was all it took. Because in the shadows behind a concrete pillar 20 meters to his left, someone had been waiting. The shot was not loud. That was the detail that stayed with him longest in the years that followed, how quiet it was. A single suppressed crack, swallowed almost immediately by the dead acoustics of the underground structure. The kind of sound you could convince yourself you hadn't heard, if everything afterward wasn't so irreversible. Jae-hyun didn't see it coming, but Ji-eun did. She had always been faster than him. Jae-hyun knelt on the frozen concrete, holding a woman who no longer held him back, and somewhere above the city continued its indifferent pulse. Traffic, neon, millions of lives moving forward without pause. He did not move for a very long time. He did not call for help. He did not weep. He simply held her, in the cold, in the silence, until the cold became part of him too. That was the moment sleep became a punishment. It began the very next night, and the night after that, and every night for 6 years without a single exception, without mercy, without variation, without the smallest sign that time intended to do what everyone promised it would. It gets easier, his doctor had said, in those early weeks when the grief was still raw enough to have a shape. The mind finds ways to protect itself. The mind did not protect Jae-hyun, prosecuted him. The days were manageable. That was the cruelest part of the arrangement his psyche had constructed. By daylight, he functioned. More than functioned. He moved through Seoul's glass towers and smoke-filled back rooms like a man assembled entirely from authority, giving nothing away, yielding nothing. Boardrooms steadied in his presence. Conversations ended when he decided they did. The empire did not pause for grief, and so neither did he. But when the sun went down, the countdown began. It was never dramatic at first. That was how it deceived him, night after night, year after year. The early hours felt almost ordinary. Dinner he rarely touched. A glass of something amber that stopped working after the 3rd month but became ritual anyway. The vast, echoing rooms of the mansion settling into silence around him as the staff retreated to their quarters and the house became, once again, entirely his. His and hers. Still hers in every way that mattered. Her photograph still sat on the shelf in the study, not because he looked at it, but because removing it felt like agreeing to something he refused to agree to. The faint trace of her perfume had long since left the pillowcase he had not replaced, though sometimes, in the thin hours before midnight, he imagined he could still catch it. Floral, gentle, proof that softness had once existed in these rooms. By 11, the restlessness would settle into his legs. By midnight, it reached his hands. He had tried everything the first 2 years. Alcohol in quantities that would have leveled a lesser man. It blurred the edges but never the center, never the specific geometry of that moment, her body's weight, the way warmth had left her so fast it felt less like death and more like theft. Sleeping pills prescribed by 3 different specialists, each dosage climbing until his advisor began watching him with that particular look men reserve for problems they cannot solve with money. He had tried complete silence, and he had tried noise, white noise machines, music, television left running through the night. He had tried exhausting himself with work until 2 a.m., hoping to outrun the clock. The clock always caught him. By the 3rd year, the mansion had completed its transformation. What had once been a home, or the closest approximation of one that a man like Jae-hyun had ever permitted himself, had become something else entirely. A living grave. The rooms were immaculate, because the staff maintained them with the efficiency of people who understood that disorder would not be tolerated. But immaculate is not the same as inhabited. The furniture sat arranged and untouched. The kitchen produced meals that grew cold. The garden beyond the east wing continued to exist purely out of botanical indifference to the suffering inside. Servants lasted weeks, not months. They left without drama, simply failing to return after their days off, sending polite messages through intermediaries. No one quit to his face. No one was brave enough for that. But the rotation was constant. New faces, careful eyes, the particular tension of people moving through a space they understood instinctively was wrong, even if they couldn't name the source of it. The source sat in the master bedroom every night at 1:16 a.m., completely still, staring at a clock. The sensory sequence was always identical. First, the smell. Something cold and metallic that had no physical origin in the room. The ghost of that parking structure, of frost and exhaust and the specific winter silence that had surrounded the worst moment of his life. Then the sound. Not the gunshot itself, but the silence just before it. That half-second of held breath that he had not recognized for what it was until it was already over. His mind had preserved it in perfect, merciless resolution. Then the weight, phantom and absolute. The remembered sensation of Ji-eun's body falling into his arms. Warm and then not, present and then permanently, irrevocably absent. His hands would begin to shake at 1:15. By 1:16 he had stopped breathing. At 1:17 his body would lock, every muscle seizing in the reflex of a man trying, 6 years too late, to move faster, to step in front, to be the one who took it instead. He never succeeded. He relived the failure every single night with the fidelity of a punishment designed specifically for him, precise, personal, and completely inescapable. His most trusted advisor had told him in the 5th year that a man cannot survive on no sleep, that the body eventually surrenders what the mind refuses to. Jae-hyun had looked at him for a long moment. Good, he had said quietly, because he was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of remembering again. She arrived on a Tuesday. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a black car pulling through the iron gates at 9:30 in the morning, and a young woman stepping out of it with a single travel bag and the unhurried composure of someone who had nowhere more important to be and knew it. The staff noticed immediately. Not because her arrival was unusual. The aunt had sent new staff before, each one lasting shorter than the last, but because of the way she moved through the entrance courtyard. Steady, unbothered. The kind of stillness that isn't performed but simply lived in, the way certain people carry quiet the way others carry noise. Her name was Chioma. And from the moment she crossed the threshold of that mansion, something in the air shifted in a way no one could immediately name. Mrs. Yoon, the head housekeeper, a small, precise woman who had survived 4 years in the mansion by perfecting the art of invisibility, intercepted her in the entrance hall before she had taken 10 steps inside. The briefing was efficient and absolute. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not linger in any room where he is present. Do not make eye contact if he passes. Do not ask questions about the household, the history, or the locked east corridor. If you hear movement after midnight, return to your room and do not investigate under any circumstances. If he is in a mood, and you will learn to recognize the specific quality of silence that precedes it, make yourself scarce within 60 seconds. Mrs. Yoon delivered all of this in a low, rapid murmur, her eyes moving to the staircase and back with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned to track the location of a predator at all times. Chioma listened to every word. Then she nodded. Not the nod of someone frightened into compliance. Not the quick, eager bob of a person desperate to signal that they understood the danger and would do everything possible to avoid it. It was a slower nod. Thoughtful. The nod of a woman who had received the information, processed it, and filed it in the appropriate place. Acknowledged but not internalized as fear. Mrs. Yoon studied her for a moment with the expression of someone who wanted to say more and decided against it. "You'll understand soon enough," her eyes said instead. Chioma picked up her bag and followed the housekeeper down the hall. He was watching from the upper landing. Jae-hyun stood motionless at the railing above the entrance foyer, positioned slightly back from the balustrade the way he stood in boardrooms, present enough to observe, removed enough to remain unreadable. It was a posture he had never consciously developed. It had simply grown on him over years of understanding that the most useful place in any room was the one where you could see everything and no one was certain they were being watched. He had observed every new staff member arrive this way. The pattern was consistent and, by now, almost tedious in its predictability. They would enter with confidence, some with more than others, and then the house would find them. Not through anything dramatic. Simply through the accumulated atmosphere of the place, the particular silence of rooms where happiness had stopped visiting, the invisible pressure of his presence filtering through walls and corridors until the new arrival began to carry their shoulders differently. Higher, tighter. The body's honest response to an environment that did not feel safe. It usually took between 4 and 48 hours. He watched Chioma cross the entrance hall. He waited for the tell, the slight hesitation in the step, the eyes casting upward and then dropping too quickly, the involuntary physical contraction that every person eventually performed in this house. She reached the center of the foyer. And then, without any apparent reason, without any sound from above, without any movement that should have drawn attention, she looked up, directly at him. Not startled, not searching, as though she had known precisely where he was standing for the last 30 seconds and had simply chosen this moment to confirm it. Jae-hyun did not move. Most people, when they found him watching, did one of two things. They looked away immediately, the eye contact severed with the panicked efficiency of someone who had touched something hot, or they overcorrected, holding his gaze a half-second too long with the brittle performance of someone determined to prove they weren't afraid, which was itself a form of fear, just dressed differently. Chioma did neither. She looked at him the way you look at a person. Not a reputation. Not a warning. Not a figure constructed from whispered stories and fearful exaggerations. A person. Present, tired, standing alone in a large house at 9:30 in the morning with nothing in his expression but the specific blankness of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything new from the world. She held his gaze for 2 calm seconds. Then she gave a single, small nod, measured and genuine, the greeting of one human acknowledging another, and followed Mrs. Yoon down the corridor without hurry. Jae-hyun stood at the railing for a long moment after she had gone. Something had moved in his chest. Faint and unidentifiable, like a sound heard from a great distance, not loud enough to name, but undeniable enough that he noticed it, which itself was strange. He could not remember the last time anything had been strange. He turned and walked back to his study. But the feeling did not follow instructions. It stayed. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and not seen a monster. It happened on the 3rd day. Not because Jae-hyun had been watching for an opportunity, or at least that was what he told himself. It was simply that the mansion had a particular acoustics to it, a way of carrying sound through corridors and around corners that made privacy largely theoretical. He heard her before he saw her. The quiet, methodical movement of someone who worked without performance. No unnecessary noise, no self-conscious silence either. Just the steady, unhurried sound of a person doing exactly what they were doing and nothing more. He found her in the study. His study. The room where the photograph still sat on the shelf and the files on the desk were not to be touched, and the entire arrangement of space communicated, in the precise vocabulary of controlled environments, that this was not a room you entered without invitation. Chioma was dusting the bookshelves along the far wall. She had her back to the door when he entered, and she did not turn immediately. Not from insolence, he registered, but simply because she had not finished the shelf she was working on. She completed the section, moved to the next, and then turned with the natural timing of someone who had not been startled because she had heard him coming and had not considered it an emergency. "This room isn't on your list," Jae-hyun said. His voice carried the specific calibration he used when precision mattered more than volume. Quiet, unhurried, and edged with the particular quality that made experienced men choose their next words very carefully. Chioma looked at him steadily. "Mrs. Yoon updated the rotation this morning," she said. "She said the study hadn't been properly cleaned in 3 weeks. Mrs. Yoon doesn't give instructions regarding this room. She may not have known that. It was not defiance. That was what unsettled him. He was fluent in defiance, had encountered every variety of it across boardrooms and backrooms and interrogation spaces, and he knew its texture intimately. Defiance had heat in it, a current of challenge that announced itself even when the words were careful. This had none of that. Chioma spoke the way she moved, evenly, without performance, as though the conversation were simply an exchange of accurate information between two people who had no particular reason to be afraid of each other. He crossed the room slowly, the way he crossed every room, as though the space rearranged itself to accommodate his presence, because it always did. He stopped in front of the desk and looked at her directly. "Do you know whose house this is?" "Yes," she said. "Then you understand that what I say about this room supersedes any rotation Mrs. Yoon believes she has authority over." "I understand that," Chioma said. She held his gaze without blinking, without the microscopic physical retreat. The chin dipping, the shoulders drawing in, that his proximity reliably produced in people. "I'll let her know the study is excluded going forward." She turned back to the shelf. Not dismissively, not provocatively, simply finished. The conversation had reached its conclusion and she had registered it, and now she was returning to work, the way a person returns to work when a conversation has concluded. Jae-hyun stood very still. In 38 years, across every environment his life had constructed, the criminal architecture of his inheritance, the corporate machinery he had built over it, the domestic spaces that had quietly become his prison, no one had ever simply turned back to what they were doing. They waited. They watched him for the signal that the interaction was over and that they had survived it correctly. The turning away was always his to initiate. He opened his mouth. And then he noticed the photograph. It had been moved. Not significantly, barely 3 inches to the left of where it had always stood. But he knew its position the way he knew the position of every object in this room because he had not touched anything in here in 6 years and neither had anyone else, which was precisely the point. "You moved it," he said. Chioma glanced at the shelf. "It was at the edge. Another inch and it would have fallen when I worked around it." She paused, cloth still in hand. "I can put it back if you'd prefer." I noted where it was. He looked at the photograph. Ji-eun in the garden of a rented house in Jeju, laughing at something outside the frame, her hair lifted by coastal wind. He had taken that photograph on a Saturday afternoon when the world had felt, briefly, like something survivable. 3 inches to the left, safe from the edge. Something caught in his throat. Not grief exactly, not the corrosive nightly variety he was accustomed to, but something quieter than that. Something that didn't immediately hurt. "Leave it where you put it," he said. His voice came out slightly different than he intended. He noticed it. Chioma, if she noticed, gave no indication. "I'll finish the rest of the rotation and be out of your way," she said simply. He left the room. In the corridor outside, he stood for a moment with no particular destination and an unfamiliar feeling moving through the architecture of his chest. Unresolved, unclassifiable, and stubbornly persistent. He had walked into that room to remind her of the order of things. He walked out of it uncertain where the order had gone. She hadn't challenged him. She had simply changed the space around him. The ritual began as it always did. By 10 o'clock, the mansion had settled into its familiar dark. The staff had disappeared to their quarters with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the later hours belonged to a different atmosphere entirely. Heavier, more pressurized, like the air before a storm that never fully broke. The lights in the main corridors dimmed on their automatic sequence. The city beyond the perimeter walls continued its indifferent glow, soul burning orange and white against a sky that never fully reached darkness. Jae-hyun sat at the edge of his bed. Not lying down, he never lay down before it happened, had learned in the first weeks that horizontal felt too much like surrender, like offering himself to it without resistance. So he sat, back straight, hands on his knees, a man at attention before a firing squad that operated on its own schedule. The glass of scotch on the nightstand was untouched. He had poured it out of habit 3 hours ago and had not looked at it since. It no longer pretended to help. It was simply something to pour, the performance of a coping mechanism that had stopped functioning 2 years into its appointment. The clock on the wall read 1:09. 8 minutes. He knew the progression by heart. 8 minutes of escalating physical dread, the kind that could not be reasoned with, that existed entirely below the register of logic or will or the considerable force of a mind that had bent most things it encountered. His body had developed its own relationship with 117, entirely independent of anything he thought or decided. His hands would begin at 1:14. His breathing would change at 1:15. By 1:16 he would be somewhere between the present and that parking structure, 1 foot in each belonging fully to neither. 1:10. He stared at the wall. The mansion was silent. And then it wasn't. It was faint enough that he almost dismissed it. A sound from somewhere below, soft and rhythmic, carrying the kind of domestic ordinariness that felt almost surreal in this house at this hour. Not alarming, not urgent, simply present in the way that very few things in the mansion were present anymore, alive, warm-edged, occupying actual space rather than merely existing within it. He was moving down the corridor before he had consciously decided to. Not quickly, not with purpose exactly, but with the particular compelled attention of a man whose nervous system had been braced for one thing and had encountered something entirely different, and did not yet know what to do with the discrepancy. The kitchen light was on. He stood in the doorway. Chioma stood at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a small pot with the patience of someone for whom patience was not an effort but simply a way of existing. The kitchen smelled, and this was the detail that stopped him physically, one hand still on the door frame, warm. Not the warmth of heat, though there was that too, but a deeper warmth carried in the smell itself. Earthy and layered, something herbal and dark and faintly sweet, the kind of smell that belonged to somewhere people were taken care of. He had not smelled anything like that in this house in 6 years. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice came out correctly, cold, controlled, the standard architecture of a sentence designed to end a situation. "No one is permitted out at this hour." Chioma did not turn immediately. She finished one slow rotation of the spoon, then another. Then she lifted the pot and poured its contents carefully into a cup, the steam rising in a quiet column in the still kitchen air. Then she turned. She did not look like someone who had been caught. "I know," she said. Her voice carried that same unhurried quality he had catalogued since her arrival. No tremor in it. No performance of calm that suggested the calm was manufactured. "But you are." He had no answer for that. She crossed the kitchen and held the cup out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "What is it?" "Something my mother made," she said simply. When the night got too loud, the clock on the kitchen wall read 1:16. His hands were shaking, the fine, deep tremor that began in the joints and worked outward, the nightly betrayal of a body that refused to pretend. He saw her register it. She did not react to it. She simply continued holding the cup with the steady patience of someone who had decided to wait as long as necessary and meant it. He took it. The warmth moved through his palms immediately, up through his wrists, into the locked muscles of his forearms. Not like medication, not the blunt chemical interruption of a sleeping pill forcing the body into unconsciousness. This was different, slower, like something being gently reminded of its original state. He stood there holding the cup and not drinking yet, and Chioma turned slightly away from him and began to hum. Low, barely audible. A melody without a name he recognized. Not a song exactly, more like the musical residue of one, the emotional shape of something ancient and unhurried. It moved through the kitchen the way the smell had moved, filling the space without crowding it. 1:17. He knew it without looking. He felt the familiar clench begin its approach in his chest. The locking, the fracture, the gunshot arriving on schedule. It didn't come. He waited. The hum continued, steady as a held hand. He waited for the smell of frost, for the weight of her body, for the sound of that half-second silence he had preserved in perfect cruelty for 6 years. The kitchen smelled of something warm and earthy. The clock ticked past. 1:18. The realization arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way the most significant things tend to arrive. He was still standing in a kitchen at 1:18 in the morning, and the night had not fractured and Ji-eun had not died again, and his hands were wrapped around a warm cup, and somewhere just beside him a woman was humming a melody his nervous system had no prior record of and was choosing, without his permission, to believe was safe. His eyes blurred. Not from pain. "You are not there anymore," Chioma said softly, without turning, as though she had read the exact location of his mind with the accuracy of someone who had navigated this terrain before. "You are here." His legs made the decision before he did. He found the chair at the kitchen table and sat down heavily, the cup still in both hands, the hum continuing its slow, grounding circuit through the air. He did not fight it. For the first time in 6 years there was nothing to fight. The dread had simply released its grip, the way a fist releases when the thing it's been holding is no longer there. His breathing slowed. His hands steadied. The weight in his chest, that permanent, load-bearing grief that had been structural for so long he had forgotten what his chest felt like without it, lifted. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe past. Enough to feel the warmth of the cup, the solidity of the chair, the reality of a kitchen that was lit and inhabited and present. His eyes closed. Not in resignation, in rest. For the first time in 6 years, the night did not break him. The sun rose over Seoul the way it always did. Indifferently, without announcement. The light arriving first at the upper floors of the city's glass towers, then descending gradually, building by building, street by street, until it reached the quieter, walled neighborhoods where power lived behind iron gates and carefully maintained hedges, and where the mornings were usually as silent and controlled as everything else. But inside the mansion on this particular morning, something was different. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was the kind of difference that lived below the threshold of the obvious, the sort you registered in your body before your mind assembled the language for it. Mrs. Yoon felt it the moment she unlocked the kitchen door at 6:45 and found the light already on. A used cup on the counter, and the faint remnant of something warm and herbal still present in the air. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, trying to identify what had shifted, before moving carefully through the house to begin the morning routine. The corridors felt different. She had worked in this mansion long enough to know its moods the way a sailor knows weather, through accumulated instinct, through the body's quiet readings of atmosphere and pressure. And the atmosphere this morning was not the usual one. The usual one had a specific weight to it, a held-breath quality that never fully released because it could not release, because the thing that created it operated on a schedule that made the whole house brace from sundown to sunrise. This morning the house was simply still, not the paralyzed stillness of dread. The other kind, the kind that follows when something long braced for does not, finally, arrive. The doctor came at 7:15. He had been making these visits for 4 years, arriving each morning with the punctual resignation of a man whose job had become the documentation of a condition he could not treat. His briefcase contained, out of habit more than hope, a fresh prescription pad and 3 different pill cases that had all proven equally decorative. Mrs. Yoon met him at the door. Her expression stopped him before she spoke. He followed her down the main corridor toward the kitchen, already reaching into his professional reserves for the appropriate response to whatever new deterioration awaited. Jae-hyun's condition had been declining measurably for the past 8 months, the tremors lasting longer, the post-episode recovery window shortening, the darkening under his eyes deepening into something that looked less like tiredness and more like the body beginning to file a formal complaint. They reached the kitchen doorway. The doctor stopped. Jae-hyun sat slumped in the kitchen chair, his head tilted slightly to one side, both hands resting open in his lap, no longer gripped, no longer braced, simply open, the way hands rest when the body has released everything it was holding. His breathing was slow and deep and entirely without the shallow, effortful quality it carried during waking hours. His face, the face that in consciousness maintained the careful blankness of a man who had decided long ago that expression was a vulnerability, was simply at rest. Peaceful. The word arrived in the doctor's mind with the disorientation of something encountered out of context. A word he associated with other patients, other cases, not this room and not this man. Beside him, one chair away, Chioma sat quietly. She had not slept. That was immediately apparent. She sat with the composed alertness of someone who had chosen wakefulness deliberately, her hands folded in her lap, her posture neither tense nor performative. She was simply there, present in the way that certain people are present, with the quality of someone whose attention is given fully and without agenda. She looked up when they appeared in the doorway. She raised one finger to her lips. The doctor did not move for a long moment. He had attended Jae-hyun through 4 years of this condition. He had read every study on trauma-induced chronic insomnia published in 3 languages. He had consulted specialists in Seoul and Tokyo and once, at considerable expense, a sleep neurologist in Zurich who had reviewed the case remotely and returned a report of carefully worded uncertainty. He had never seen this. No machines. No modification. No restraints against the nightly thrashing that had broken 2 different bed frames in the past year. Just a man sleeping in a kitchen chair, hands open, face at rest. And beside him, a woman who had simply stayed. Mrs. Ji-eun pressed her hand over her mouth. The doctor set his briefcase down very slowly on the corridor floor, as though a sudden sound might break something irreplaceable. He stood in the doorway and watched the chest rise and fall, steady, deep, real, and felt the particular professional disorientation of a man whose models have just been quietly disproven. The dragon was gone. Only a man remained. A tired, ordinary, deeply exhausted man who had finally, in a kitchen that smelled of something warm, in the unhurried presence of someone who had not been afraid of him, found his way back to his own body. His hands were open. His face was unguarded. He looked, for the first time in 6 years, like someone who might survive. The morning light moved through the kitchen window and fell across him without drama. The way grace tends to arrive, sideways quietly, in rooms where no one was looking for it. Peace had entered the house. But peace never comes without a price. Across the city, in a room that had never been intended for comfort, the news arrived quietly. Not through official channels. Not through the network of structured communication that Jae-hyun had spent years designing with the precision of a man who understood that information, controlled correctly, was more reliable than any weapon. It arrived the way the most dangerous information always arrives, through a person who had been trusted completely, for a long time, for exactly this purpose. The room was on the 14th floor of a building in Mapogu that officially belonged to a logistics consultancy that officially turned a modest profit and officially employed 32 people, none of whom were ever required to understand the full nature of what moved through the building's private upper floors. The furniture was minimal. The lighting was low. A single window looked out over the Han River, its surface catching the early morning light in flat, indifferent silver. Min-kyu stood at that window with his hands clasped behind his back. He had been Jae-hyun's most trusted lieutenant for 11 years. He had stood in rooms where decisions were made that restructured the criminal architecture of 3 districts. He had managed logistics, managed personnel, managed the particular category of problem that could not be solved through legitimate means and could not be left unsolved. He had done all of this with the reliable discretion of a man whose loyalty had never once been publicly questioned. That was, of course, the point. The man sitting across the room lowered his phone and looked up. "He's sleeping now?" he said. Min-kyu did not turn from the window immediately. He let the question sit for a moment, not because he needed to consider the answer, but because he had learned long ago that the quality of a man's silences communicated more about his thinking than his words did, and he was still thinking. "Apparently," Min-kyu said. "How?" "The new maid." He said it without inflection, the way he said most things, evacuated of tone, clinical, the verbal equivalent of a document. She was in the kitchen with him at 1:17. He fell asleep in the chair. The doctor confirmed it this morning. Peaceful. No episode. The man across the room was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled, a short, almost amused sound that did not reach his eyes. "1 night," he said. "1 night is enough to confirm the pattern has broken," Min-kyu replied. "If she can do it again, the deterioration stops. He stabilizes." He paused. He had cataloged them the way a structural engineer catalogues stress points, not with malice exactly, but with the dispassionate thoroughness of someone building a timeline. Waiting for the building to reach, she had established no formal arrangement. No one had asked her to, and she had not offered. It had simply evolved with the organic logic of something that worked. She remained available in the late hours, present somewhere in the lower floor of the house, the soft sounds of her movement or the faint warmth of the kitchen light visible under the door creating a perimeter of the ordinary around the hour that had been, for 6 years, entirely extraordinary. She never intruded. That was the precise and essential quality of what she offered. It was presence without pressure, the rare human ability to occupy space near another person without demanding anything from that proximity. She did not ask him about Ji-eun. She did not acknowledge the photograph or the locked east corridor or the particular weight that settled on him in the late afternoon when the light changed and the day began its approach toward dark. She did not treat him as a project. She treated him as a person who was having a difficult time, which was both more accurate and more dignified than any other framework anyone had offered him in 6 years. He had begun, with great caution and no acknowledgement, to rely on it. On the 9th night he had fallen asleep in the kitchen chair again, and when he woke at 4 in the morning, rested, disoriented, briefly uncertain of where he was. His hand had shifted across the table in sleep and his fingers rested near hers. Not holding, not grasping, just near. He had looked at that for a moment in the 4 a.m. silence. Then he had looked at her, awake, watching him with the same steady, undemanding attention she carried everywhere, and said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He stood, straightened his shirt with the residual dignity of a man who had been seen in an unguarded moment and was deciding not to be diminished by it, and walked back to his room. But he had slept again before 5. What he did not know, what no one inside the mansion's carefully maintained perimeter had yet understood, was the geometry of what was assembling outside it. It was not loud. It was never loud when Min-kyu was the architect. It moved through the organization the way a structural fault moves through a building, silently along existing lines of stress, invisible until the moment it became catastrophic. Quiet conversations with board members who had their own ambitions. Strategic delays in information reaching Jae-hyun's desk. Nothing obvious, nothing traceable, just a slight thickening of the usual flow. A loyalty audit, conducted without authorization, of the 6 men closest to Jae-hyun's inner circle, and a file, growing thicker by the day, on a woman named Chioma. Her background, her habits, her schedule inside the mansion, the specific hours she was present on the lower floor. The detail, noted with the cold efficiency of someone who understood leverage, that Jae-hyun had not experienced an episode on any night she had been present near the kitchen. The file was titled, in Min-kyu's precise handwriting, simply, the variable. On the 14th night, Jae-hyun reached for Chioma's hand in his sleep. She did not move away. She stayed, as she had stayed every night, without ceremony, without expectation. And outside the walls of the mansion the city pulsed with the movement of men making plans, and the empire that had been built from silence began, in that same silence, to fracture along lines its architect could not yet see. His breathing was slow. His hands were open. And somewhere across the city, in a room overlooking the Han River, a phone call was made that could not be unmade. He had finally learned how to rest. But the world he ruled was about to wake him up.